and welcome back to Mother Tongue, your eyes, ears, and finger on the pulse for all parents around the world. Let's get going, shall we?
We are so incredibly excited to welcome Jessie Harrold to Mother Tongue. Jessie, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for having me on the show. This is great.
Thanks for coming. I mean, we're talking about a topic that genuinely, hand on heart, had never heard about. I'd never used this word in a sentence. I'd never even heard anyone say this word before. So I'm actually so excited to get into this topic today. And I'm going to say it, and I'm probably going to say it wrong again. Matrescence.
You got it right.
We're going to talk about matrescence, and I'm really excited. But before we delve into that, can you please start, Jessie, by telling our lovely listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a coach and a doula. I became a doula 17 years ago. And so ever since then, I've been supporting women and mothers through the kinds of life changes that changes everything, you know, these what I call radical transformations in their lives. And so that's kind of what I do for a living. And I have 2 kiddos. I'm the mom of 2.
Love this. And I mean, how would you describe your own experience with matrescence? In fact, before we start with that, what is matrescence? What does this word actually mean?
Yeah. Matrescence refers to the transition to motherhood. And it's a transition that's biological, it's psychological, it's social and cultural, it's economic, it's often spiritual. So it's literally, when I say it's like the changes that change everything, that's exactly what it is. I'm sure the mothers listening will be like, oh yeah, definitely that. And it takes 2 to 3 years to traverse. So it's not, we typically talk about maybe that first 6 weeks postpartum, or we talk about the 4th trimester now, that first 3 months postpartum. And what matrescence says is like, actually, it's not just this sort of change to your body or change to the things you're doing, like behaviors that you're doing differently, but it's a change to who you are and how you move through the world. And so it takes time.
I mean, is there a reason you become so passionate about this topic? How was your own experience becoming a mother?
Totally. Well, so it was pretty interesting. So matrescence is a word that's kind of come on the sort of popular scene in the last 5 or 6 years, but it was originally coined in 1975 by a social anthropologist named Dr. Dana Raphael. But then kind of all of the research and all of the kind of information sort of went underground and we didn't talk about it. But when I was pregnant with my first kid 13 years ago, actually, no, I should rewind a little bit further. It was before I was pregnant with my first kid. I was already a doula, and I was at this talk that was given by a doula for other birth workers. And in the talk, she said the transition to motherhood takes 2 to 3 years. And at the time, I was feeling a little bit ambivalent about the idea of motherhood, even though I'd been a doula, I'd been surrounded by mothers and babies. I wasn't sure if this was my path. And I could have taken that to be really scary, like, oh dear, this is going to take a long time. But I was actually profoundly reassured by it because it felt like I could just kind of, screw it all up sometimes or, maybe even regret motherhood sometimes, and it would all be okay. I had time to figure it out. And so this woman actually ended up becoming my doula. I did get pregnant. And so here I was being supported by somebody, the only person I knew at the time, who was talking about this transition into motherhood as something quite monumental, like who was really giving voice to the things I think we all feel. So she was talking about matrescence before we ever talked about matrescence. And so I was kind of queued up to be thinking about this. And she really supported me through my own process. I mean, she became a mentor and she ended up supporting me I just had tea with her the other day, really helping me to understand who I was becoming as a mother and as a woman who happened to be a mother. And so that's kind of where this journey began. So I was kind of queued up to think about this experience and started talking about it with the mothers that I was working with and I was supporting as a doula. And it just kind of took off from there.
Wow. I mean, so obviously you said that this wonderful woman kind of helped you through this period. What kind of things did she do that helped you, that supported you, that kind of made you understand that this was a journey and you were going to come through the other side and things were going to feel so much better? Because let's be honest, when you are a first-time mum and you're in the thick of that first year, let's be honest, God, it can be lonely, it can be terrifying, it can be emotional, it can be quite depressing at times as well. What kind of tools did she give you to kind of help you prepare for this?
I think, even just the kind of validation and reassurance that, it's normal, that everything feels like it's changing. I think a lot of us, especially before we've had this lexicon about matrescence, we kind of expect to just, we have this cultural narrative around bouncing back, right? And that, the worst thing that could happen is that motherhood might change you. So we go into motherhood, especially the first time around, feeling like changing in the process is not a good thing, that we should, come out the other side of birth, ourselves plus a baby. And so then I think a lot of us experience a real kind of cognitive dissonance when it actually feels like, oh, wait, but my relationship to my body has changed. My relationship with my partner has changed. My friendships don't feel the same. I don't feel the same about my job anymore. I don't want to live where I live anymore. And the list goes on, right? There's so many things. So I think her naming and validating that for me and kind of walking alongside me for as long as she did, because shortly thereafter, though I was a doula, it was kind of like a moonlight gig and I was working in a very corporate setting, and she helped me to kind of move out of that and into a different job, because for me, that was really up in my matrescence, was that I wasn't happy in my career. And, I think that matrescence can be this really focusing and clarifying event, even though we don't know who we are and we're feeling disoriented. We kind of get a different sense of our priorities, right? We have this little human who requires a lot of us. And so it becomes that much more important that the time we do have for ourselves is time well spent, and that the energy and resources we do have are going to things that matter to us. So we can often find a lot of clarification in our values. And she really helped me with that too, just kind of understanding who I was becoming and allowing that kind of pre-motherhood self, allowing me to kind of have the space and time I needed to grieve and let go of that part of myself.
Was there a moment where you were that you felt yourself again, but it was your new self?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's funny because for me and for most of the people that I work with, it's not necessarily a moment, but so many of us, I think, around that 2 or 3 year mark, and I think it's different. I think a lot of mamas who've had babies during the pandemic experienced a bit of a longer transition into motherhood because they didn't have that social referencing and that support that would have helped them in the process. But for a lot of people around that 2 to 3 year mark, they just kind of think there's this fog that lifts, I guess. And you kind of think, oh yeah, no, I feel as though I am a mother, that this is a part of my identity, that it's integrated. I always joke that someone might call out at the playground, mama, and you don't, look around looking for, whose mama that could be. It's you, right? And so it's sort of intangible. But I think, another thing that I talk about in my book, MotherSHIFT, which is about this transition to motherhood, is that I stopped wishing or wanting to be who I used to be. It was almost like an absence of that grief that helped me to know that I was in this new life now, both feet in,
Yeah. It's really weird. We were actually, I was talking about this to my husband the other day. And I actually don't know, I don't remember when it shifted, but we were watching White Lotus, as you do. New season is out and it's very all consuming. And there was this scene where they're all on this boat and they're all getting very drunk, they're taking drugs, and all I could think was, oh my God, I'm so glad I'm not going to have to deal with that hangover tomorrow. There was not one bit of me that was like, oh my God, I really crave that. I really want to go and have like a big blowout and go and stay up late and drink with my friends. I was like, no, get me in bed by 9 p.m., get me waking up at 6 a.m. feeling fresh. And, you know, I'm like, there has been such a shift. And I was a big drinker. I love to drink. I would drink on the weekends. I was a heavy smoker. I would stay up late. I'm now like a totally different human. And I can't really put a point on like when it changed, when it shifted, but I'm so happy in this phase of life. And it's almost like I don't know this other person. But I'm really glad that she happened. And I'm really glad that she had a great time. But I'm also really, really glad that I'm now in this phase and really enjoying it and feeling very comfortable in it. But it's amazing, the shift, because men don't go through this really ever, do they?
It's really different. I think they do, and there is this kind of, people are starting to use the word matrescence to speak about maybe this male experience. But it's funny, ever since I started teaching this in prenatal classes like a decade ago, I would say for a mother who's carrying her baby, who's pregnant with her baby, she often kind of feels this transformation, like really literally from the day she pees on a stick, right? Like all of a sudden, maybe if you have morning sickness or something, like the things that you used to like to do or eat or whatever aren't accessible anymore. There's like parts that your body doesn't feel, it's changing under your very eyes. There's so much that's shifting. By the time you actually birth your baby, you've actually gone through a lot of shift. You've let go of a lot. You've kind of had this heads up. For most of the kind of hetero couples that I've worked with, the whole concept of having a baby is a bit foreign until the baby's in your arms. So we might imagine that process might begin then. But again, in sort of our culture, and again, I'm painting with a pretty wide brush, but a lot of men will go back to work fairly quickly afterwards. And maybe this mama is at home looking after a baby. And what we know about caregiving and this sort of identity transformation is that it requires practice. And so mothers, we get practice even before we've had babies. Often we're socialized to play with dolls and take care of people and all of these things. So we learn, it's very entrenched what it is to mother, to be a mother, and to engage in the act of mothering. For men, they haven't necessarily had this practice. Then they go back to work. And we have a culture that actually says maybe that's not your job. Maybe they were raised in a household or in a culture that says it's not a man's job to be attuned emotionally or to caregive. And so I think they've got a lot working against them in a lot of ways to fully step into this parenting identity. You and I as mothers, like we probably hang out with our friends and inevitably talk about children and mothering. And, I don't know that happens as often for our male partners. So again, we're learning even in our social context. We're asking each other about our parenting practices. I don't see that happening as often for my husband and his male friends. And I think, again, I'm painting with a wide brush. This is a generalization. But when we're talking about the ways we've been socialized as men and women, mothers and fathers in our culture, like, yes, they go through this transformation, but it's a little bit more optional because our culture kind of has said for so many years that, parenting isn't necessarily the job of the male partner.
Yeah. I mean, I must say my husband is fantastic. He's very, very helpful. And I know I'm very lucky because I know that lots of my friends struggle. They struggle.
Yeah.
And there builds up a lot of resentment. And I feel like we don't need to be adding more to our plates when we're going through this massive change in life. But how does matrescence compared to the change that we go through during adolescence? Is it a bigger change? Because obviously that is, I mean, I don't really remember it, but it is a big change for someone going from a young girl to more of a young woman.
Totally. Well, they sound alike for a reason, right? They're both kind of these really transformational times. And again, those sort of domains of life that they span that I mentioned in the beginning, biological, psychological, social, all of these things, apply to both transformations. The interesting thing about adolescence is that we assume that it's actually going to take quite some time, right? Like my kiddo started going through adolescence around into that phase 10, 11 years old. And there's a lot of changes that we can still expect when she's like 16, 17. That's a chunk of time. We expect it to be a little awkward, a little uncomfortable, maybe even kind of crappy, right? Like I think that's just sort of a cultural understanding that we have. And we don't ever expect adolescents to bounce back. In fact, we think it's bad if our, 18-year-old starts acting like a child, right? We don't expect them to return. And we see this ultimately as a process of growth and development and maturity. We're hoping that these young people become upstanding members of society and become mature adults. And so all of these things are true about matrescence. But the way we see matrescence is, well, if we acknowledge it at all, we expect that you move through it very quickly. Mm-hmm. We expect it to be all, rainbows and sunshine. And we tend to kind of not talk about the grief of letting go of a former self. We tend to not talk about the challenges as much. And then the amazing thing about matrescence is, when I was writing my book and working with mothers, I really took this framework of adult development psychology, which looks at kind of the milestones that we experience as we grow up in our adult years, right? So we think about our kids' milestones, but we actually have milestones as adults that indicate that we're becoming even more mature and even more, suited to become elders in our kind of communities. And matrescence, what it does is it just rockets people into this developmental growth. There are so many aspects of this transformation that are so profoundly just profoundly growth inducing, I guess. And yet we don't talk about any of that stuff. No. So there's there's so much overlap and so much similarity, but we give a lot more attention and credit to the experience of adolescence than we do of matrescence.
Yeah, which is wild. What are some of the common misconceptions around the tradition to motherhood?
Well, I think, like I've touched on that it takes 6 weeks or 3 months.
Yeah.
That would be like one of the biggest ones.
Lie.
Totally. It takes time. I think one of the things, and this can be a bit of a nuanced topic, so I'll ask everyone listening to kind of hold some nuance with me, but I think when things don't go well, when it's challenging in matrescence, we're quick as a culture to label that as postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety. And sometimes that is what is indeed happening. But there are a lot of reproductive psychologists who are positing that we're actually over-diagnosing those things because we don't have a good understanding of what matrescence is and how hard it can be, but that it's normal. And so it's a tricky and it's a nuanced thing to talk about. But the research shows us that about 40% of mothers have some, distress in this transformation. It's hard. It's challenging. You don't know who you are. You're disoriented. But they don't have postpartum depression. They are, You know, they're going through this normal life phase that's hard and also profoundly growth inducing, and it ends. Yeah. So that's, I think, a big one.
I think I'm really glad you brought this up, because I've been seeing a therapist now, God, on and off for, let's call it a year. Mostly because I kept on getting really burnt out and like massively just hitting rock bottom, and then kind of pulling myself back up and going again until I burnt out, and it was just this really stupid cycle. So I was like, right, well, something's not quite right here. Let's have a chat about this. Anyway, I went to see her when I was about 6 weeks postpartum, and we were talking about this kind of, it was almost like I've had this with every single one of my babies. I don't really want anyone else to hold them, touch them. I get very anxious when people, are holding the baby. I've kept them all very, very close to me all the time. If I've taken the baby out for a doctor's appointment or something, I then have this massive urge just to basically hibernate, not see anyone, not talk to anyone, go back to bed, sit with the baby, and just be alone in silence. Yeah. And I was like, I'm really worried that there's something wrong with me, because I don't want to do anything. I just want to hibernate. And she's like, this is so normal. You understand? Every mum feels like this. This is just this is what happens when people have babies. They have this urge to protect, to hibernate, to go to ground, to stay safe. And this will pass. And I was like, oh, really? Yeah. Really? And it did. And yeah. Almost me acknowledging it and making space for it and leaning into it a little bit. Then when I came out of it so nicely and so naturally this time. I have a 10-week-old at the moment. Whereas before, I really tried to fight it, and I tried to almost like beat it out of me. And it made the process of coming out the other side so much longer. And you're right, people could say, oh, she's got a bit of baby blues or something like that. But actually, no, I think it's just a natural step of coming out of, the postpartum period. But it's crazy. And then I wanted to touch upon guilt, because I feel like guilt is a universal thing that mums feel. And guilt has really taken me by surprise, because I've never really been a person I haven't really sat long with guilt. If I've done something wrong, I then try to wrong or right. If I'm feeling guilty about something, I then try to make it better. That's kind of always been my go-to approach. Whereas mum guilt just stays. I just feel like whatever I do, I still feel guilty about something. Why is there this mum guilt? And why as mums do we put this pressure on ourselves that we have to have it all, or do it all, or be all?
Yeah, it's got you ready for a history lesson?
Yeah.
It does have a long history. And I mean, okay, sorry. I think
Are you back? Yeah.
What just happened to me? There we go. Okay. Yeah. In short, it's not you, it's the culture that we live in, and we have just a really intense and strong and like abundant cultural messaging around what a good mother is, or what a perfect mother is. And, in recent years, or like in the last decade, I guess, we are exposed to that constantly on social media. So there's these kind of ideas about what we should be doing. And ultimately, they're unattainable by most of us, right? And so I think a lot of us feel guilt about that. And I think, there's a lot of reasons why those ideals are unattainable, but a lot of us don't have the kind of support that we were like evolutionarily, biologically designed to have to raise our kids. And so, if we're feeling guilty because our kids are sitting in front of screens, or because we're like losing our temper, because we're touched out, or, those are two of the big reasons that I hear from mothers, like, we should have other people to help us with our kids. It's not normal, actually, for us to be, raising children mostly in isolation, or with maybe one other partner. We're meant to have lots of people hold those babies and play with those kids. And so when it's all on us, in a lot of ways. It's, we do have to kind of, rely on things like screen time, or it can be really overwhelming. And then we feel guilty about that. And I think, something really interesting that one of my colleagues, Dr. Sophie Brock, talks about, the anger guilt trap. So
Yeah.
it can
Yes.
often, right? You can often kind of like guilt and feeling kind of constrained by your own guilt or by all those shoulds can make you really angry.
Yeah.
And then, or, you can kind of end up losing your temper, and then you feel guilty about that. And then you get angry about the guilt. Like, it becomes quite a cycle, I think, for a lot of mothers. And all of this, like, we're not talking about it, right? So many of us are kind of like, performing good motherhood on social media and out in the world because we don't have this kind of honest dialogue about what we're all going through. So it really reinforces that sense of like, gosh, everybody else must be doing this better than me, or, I'm not doing it well enough or right at all. And it couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're so right. And I mean, I'm all for support. And I think where we are, there is the option to, like, it's a very big nanny culture here. And lots of people who live in the Middle East have nannies and have that support system. But even now we have a wonderful woman who helps us with our children, but there's still not enough hands. With three young kids under the age of 4, me who works full time and a nanny, even though the kids are at school for part of the day, there is just not enough hands. And it's a constant juggle. And I find every single day I'm literally thinking about the worst, best scenario, if that makes sense. And it's a constant, like, well, if I go, I need to go and do a supermarket shop. Which children should I take with me to do that? Which is going to be the least painful of the 3? It's just, I'm constantly swapping and changing between them and taking them here, there, and everywhere, and it's just crazy. It's absolutely crazy. But again, I think the one thing that I have learned from motherhood is everything is a stage and a phase, and you go on to the next phase, and there's new problems that are frustrating and make you feel even more guilty, but they're different. So it's a change of pace. But I feel like we're forever learning. And I mean, look, we talk about self-care and self-love and self-compassion like it's a buzzword nowadays, and people go on and on about it on social media. Whether people actually do it or not, I'm not so sure. But are there any self-care practices that you particularly love which can help us feel more grounded and more connected with ourselves during this really big life transformation?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked. What I think is accessible and possible for most mothers today in our culture is what I would call micro self-care. So, I mean, we should definitely like stomp our feet and wave our hands about how unfair that is, and how, yes, we should all have abundant amount of time and resources to access really luscious self-care. But the truth of the matter is most of us can't. And so, this is kind of modeled after something that I started to do a couple of years ago. I homeschooled my kids for a year. I was also working full time. It was a lot. And yeah, it was, ultimately not that great for me in the end. And I would do it differently were I to do it again. But I was pretty stretched thin. And I started kind of doing this little ritual that I called first sip outside. And I even made a little hashtag first sip outside. And I would make my morning tea, and I would go outside and I'd close the patio door behind me. And like, my kids kind of knew, they were old enough to know that they were not to cross that threshold for like the time that I was out there. And it would literally be a minute or two, and I would take the first sip of my tea outside, and I would just like listen for the birds, feel the air on my face, try my best to kind of allow that moment to nourish me, because I think sometimes we can go through the motions of self-care and it doesn't really land in us as nourishment. And then I would go back inside and I'd continue my hectic day. Um, I think it's moments like those and tiny little rituals um, that really, really can support mothers the most. And sometimes we just have to decide that this is self-care and name it that. Me going out and taking one sip of tea, it's not, you're not going to find it in like a women's magazine about the thing you should be doing for self-care, right?
Yeah.
But it was possible, and it helped tremendously, actually,
Yeah, I
because
can
I just
imagine.
decided it needed to, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think the other thing is, there this whole notion of self-care, you can read a million articles and they're like, dry brush your legs or give
Yeah.
yourself a face mask every night and all this kind of stuff. And then sometimes it can go the other way. You kind of get yourself into this horrible place where you feel like you have to do all these things, because if you're
Yeah.
not, then you're not giving yourself self-love. And that's just adding more to your very, very busy, overwhelmed plate.
You
And
got it.
actually, what we need to do is simple things like, for me, when I get very overwhelmed, I start to spiral. When there's a lot going on and there's a lot of noise and I have kids shouting at me and my emails are coming up on my phone, I start going into this weird cycle on my phone where, like, even without thinking, I check WhatsApp, Instagram, emails, WhatsApp, Instagram, emails, and I just kind of go round in this circle. But I'm not actually doing anything. I'm just clicking a load of buttons. So
Yeah.
I have to totally disconnect, put all phones, laptops, everything away, and go and just walk outside for 5 minutes by
Yeah.
myself, not listening to anything, just walking. And that is the break that I need to then come back and I feel more. Like, that's my self-love, basically. That's what I do if I need to. It's not I do it every day. I just do it when I need to do it. And I feel like that's good enough for me. But I like your first sip. The only problem is when I get up at the moment, it's normally dark.
Oh, legit. Yeah.
So it's not helping me that much at the moment, because everyone's always like, get up and go and walk outside and see the sun. And I'm like, there's no sun at 5:30 a.m. Thank you very much.
Yes. I started making friends with the very, very early mornings when I had young kids because that was the only time I got to
Yeah.
myself. I still do. I mean, they're older now. They can just do their own thing while I do my own thing. But yeah, it's the early mornings for me.
Yeah, yeah. This is also my time. Like, I love getting up before the kids because the house is actually quiet and I can sit and enjoy a cup of coffee, and everything actually feels better when I've had the cup of coffee. So,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
how I wanted to talk about workplaces, and I mean, I work for myself, which comes with its whole roster of pros and cons, let's call it that.
Mhm.
But what changes could people make to make the workplace support matrescence more?
Yeah, this is a great, great question. Um, because I think work is often one of the things that's really up for people. And for the vast majority of my clients, and for me too, particularly those who worked in, like as employees of a workplace, for example, it's just a lack of flexibility and the lack of recognition of just how all-consuming parenting is. And so I think we've got to go, there's a long way to go in terms of um, making sure that parents have enough vacation time, or there's understanding when the school calls and your kids just puked, or you name it. There's so much of that needed, because I think that's often the reason why so many people think about changing their careers. It's not because their career suddenly becomes just reprehensible to them. It's because the conditions under which they're being asked to work are, well, they're inhumane to begin with, and they become that much more impossible when you have young children and you're sleep deprived and your attention is pulled in all of these different directions. So I think that's like the biggest thing. And I think for people listening, whether or not are an employee or self-employed, like, just be gentle on yourself and expect that you probably will feel a different way about how you earn your living when you become a parent. It's just going to be up for you. And that doesn't mean your career is necessarily going to change, but that you should have some compassion for yourself if it does feel a little bit, crunchy for a little while.
Yeah. And sometimes there's some excitement in that. I kind of think you can
Yes.
turn it on its head and see it as a positive as opposed to a negative. Um, what if you were to leave a mum who's really, really resisting the change? Because I think a lot of us do, especially, when you're a first time mum. I think when you kind of go through the children a bit more, you kind of move forward a bit easier. But first time round, I really struggled. I was like, is this my life now? It feels like Groundhog Day. I'm going to have to do bath and bedtime for like the next 18 years. Why? This is terrifying.
Yeah.
But how can mothers embrace the transition instead of resisting it all the time?
Yeah, yeah. I think, when you're in it, you're right. You feel like, even though intellectually you might know that this too shall pass, you just would really like somebody to prove it to you because it doesn't feel like it will, right? So I don't know if there's anything I can do to necessarily like placate people because, we just roll our eyes like, oh, it goes so fast, or all of that kind of stuff. It doesn't feel real. What I find to be the necessary ingredient is sort of maybe paradoxical to some people, is actually to move through some grief work, and to really feel the loss of that former self, and to not try to like rush through to the other side of this transformation, to not try to necessarily figure out who you are or what's next at this point in your life. That actually, first, I always say to the mothers that I work with that you can't do the growth without the grief. You can't actually effectively move into this new version of yourself without letting go of who you used to be. If you
Yeah.
don't do that work, I find people kind of end up trying to like recreate the circumstances of their past. And that's really painful because you're new now.
No, I agree with that. Um, and tips and products, Jessie. Let's start with the tip. If you were to leave us with one tip today, what would it be? Yeah. No, I agree with that. And then what about a product? If you were to leave us with one product, what would it be? Yes, please. I'm Googling it now. I love this. I absolutely love this. And Jessie, for anyone who wants to reach out and find you, where can they find you? Thank you, Jessie. And I will link everything in the show notes. Honestly, you've been so great. Thank you for teaching me so much this evening. And I've learned a new word, matrescence. Love it. So thank you. And we'll be seeing you again very soon, I'm sure.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Okay, stay there. Let me load all this up.